All right, welcome back. I'm going to do the second section of chapter 12, looking at circulation and gas exchange. And so we're going to talk about the different ways that organisms take in oxygen and get rid of CO2 due to their different environments, and then talk about differences between their circulatory systems, primarily between open versus closed circulatory systems. So remember, organisms, they need, or I should say, most animals need to take in oxygen to undergo cellular respiration. So they need oxygen to survive. And so they take in this oxygen by some type of respiration. We'll talk about the different types. And then they transport that oxygen by using some type of circulation system or circulatory system. Now, the thing I want to emphasize is that the circulatory system, not only does it carry blood and oxygen, but it can carry away waste, water, and nutrients as well. So remember, organisms that live in different environments, they might have a different way to do these two jobs or two functions. So the first way for gas exchange that I want to discuss is diffusion. We've talked about diffusion before, way back when we talked about cells, but diffusion is the movement of substances from high concentrations to an area of low concentration. You're at the top of the hill, you're sliding down the bottom of the hill, it does not require any energy. So that's a benefit of diffusion. It does not require any energy. So diffusion is used in simple animals like our sponges, where tissues are just a few cells thick and they can just do this diffusion very rapidly. No special structures are needed. There are some organisms that actually can breathe through their skin through the process of diffusion, like frogs. Frogs have lungs, but they can also breathe through their skin through the process of diffusion. This type of way that organisms can take in oxygen tends to deal with insects and arachnids. That's called spiracles. Tiny little holes on the surface through their exoskeleton, if you will, where oxygen enters and CO2 leaves the body. And so insects, once the oxygen enters through the spiracle, it travels through tracheal tubes that carries oxygen throughout their body. And tracheal tubes are just hose-like structures that branch into smaller tubes and try to reach every part of the organism. Now, arachnids, they don't specifically have spiracles. They actually have something called book lungs that take in oxygen. It's just a bunch of stacks of folded wall-like structures used for taking in oxygen and getting rid of CO2. So these are spiracles, tiny little openings found alongside the body of the insect here, of this grasshopper, and you can see that we have tracheal tubes that branch off into smaller. Now, so my question to you is, if you take a grasshopper and you dunk just its head in water, are you drowning the grasshopper? And you should say no. If you just put the head in the water of a grasshopper, it's not going to drown. So if you want to drown a grasshopper, I'm not saying go drown a grasshopper, but I'm just emphasizing that their respiration structures are found on their bodies. Now, book lungs are found underneath the arachnids here, and you can kind of see this tiny little opening, the spiracle, but they don't have tracheal tubes. They just have these stacks of book-like cells that are stacked on top of each other for surface area, and they take in oxygen and get rid of CO2. Now, animals that are aquatic use gills, so oxygen is diffused through. So again, they're still using diffusion, but they have the secondary structure of the gills here, where water enters the mouth. Oxygen is taken out by gill filaments, and the gills are surrounded by capillaries to carry that oxygen to cells found in other parts of the organism. So, lungs, bag-like organs that can be filled with air, usually used by animals that live on land. Lungs fill, we breathe in, we breathe out, oxygen diffuses in the capillaries, CO2 diffuses out of the cells and the capillaries. So all of these processes are basically using diffusion to bring oxygen in and release CO2 out. Okay, don't do those. Moving on to circulation. So there are two types of circulatory systems, open versus closed. And so open means that blood as well as other fluids flow into open spaces that surround the organ. So the oxygen and nutrients enter all tissues and cells directly, and then again they're going to use diffusion, but in order to move these fluids they have to use their muscles. And so a downside is it can take a very long time for the blood to move throughout the organism, and so insects use an open circulatory system. Closed circulatory systems means that the fluids or materials are going to travel through blood vessels. So insects do not have blood vessels. but like us, we do, frogs do, humans do. So we have muscles that surround vessels to help push blood through, but we also tend to have an organ that helps to push that blood through, aka the heart. But the blood vessels keep blood as well as plasma separated from fluids and other structures, and we can transport materials a lot faster through these blood vessels than an open circulatory system where it kind of just pools in a certain area. So here's an open system where you might see some blood vessels, but then that fluid is released into an open area for absorption and then somehow gets back to the pump to be pushed through. Whereas in a closed system, it stays in vessels the entire time. So this leads me to chambered hearts for the closed circulatory system. So fish have two chambers, a two-chamber heart, an atrium and a ventricle right here. Amphibians have three, two atriums and a ventricle right here. Birds and mammals have four, two atriums and two ventricles. And so animals that have 3 or 4 chambers have lungs. Fish do not, they have gills. Okay. All right, so that does it for section 12.2. So you have to complete the rest of the 12.1, 12.2 worksheet. That's due tomorrow. Tomorrow you're going to take a quiz on 12.1 and 12.2. Make sure you just focus on mostly vocab words and just the different ways that organisms take in oxygen. Make sure you know the difference between an open circulatory system and a closed circulatory system. So, yeah.